You think you've seen bad westerns? Well, partner, saddle up, because we're about to ride through the dustiest, rustiest, and most unwatchable westerns the 1970s had to offer. These films didn't just miss the mark, they shot themselves in the foot. What's up, movie lovers? Welcome back to the channel. The 1970s was actually a fascinating decade for westerns. We got masterpieces like The Wild Bunch, Butch Cassidy, and the outlaw Josie Wales. But for every gem, there were tumbleweeds rolling through theaters because audiences stayed far, far away from some truly terrible films. Today, we're counting down 15 of the absolute worst westerns the 70s had to offer. From wooden acting to nonsensical plots, from miscast stars to outright boring storylines, these films prove that not every western can be a classic. If you're a fan of cinema history, the good, the bad, and the ugly, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss our deep dives into movie mayhem. 15. The Great Scout and Cathouse Thursday, 1976. We're starting with a comedy western that forgot to be funny. Lee Marvin and Oliver Reed star in this confused mess about aging frontiersmen trying to reclaim stolen gold. What makes it bad? Well, imagine talented actors like Marvin completely wasted on juvenile humor and a script that can't decide if it wants to be a buddy comedy or a revenge tale. Critics called it tired and unfunny, and audiences agreed, staying away in droves. Even the title is confusing. The film tries way too hard to be irreverent, but just ends up being tedious. The biggest problem is the tone. It lurches between slapstick comedy and serious Western drama without any sense of balance. Marvin, who could be both menacing and funny, is reduced to mugging for the camera. Oliver Reed looks genuinely embarrassed throughout. The jokes fall flat. The action sequences lack energy, and the romantic subplot with Kay Lenz feels tacked on and uncomfortable. At over 100 minutes, it overstays its welcome by at least half an hour. Even fans of 70s westerns consider this one a painful chore to sit through. It's consistently ranked on Flickchart's list of the worst westerns of the decade for good reason. 14. Catlo, 1971. Yul Brynner as a cattle rustler? Sounds promising, right? Wrong. Catlo is a spaghetti western-style film that somehow manages to be both frenetic and boring at the same time. Shot in Spain, this wannabe Sergio Leone production has all the ingredients but none of the flavor. The action scenes drag, the plot meanders like a drunk cowboy, and despite having Richard Craven and Leonard Nimoy, yes, Mr. Spock himself, in the cast, nothing can save this one from being utterly forgettable. Critics panned it for poor execution, and it's consistently ranked among the worst westerns of the decade. Number 13. Zandy's Bride, 1974. How do you make a boring western starring Gene Hackman and Liv Ullmann? Well, Swedish director Jan Troell found a way. This slow-paced psychological drama about a mail-order bride might have good intentions, but it's an absolute slog to sit through. Hackman plays Zandy, a rancher who treats his new wife like property. The film aims for harsh realism but lands in uncomfortable and tedious territory. One reviewer called it clunky and boring, and that's being generous. The pacing moves at a snail's pace, and despite the talent involved, it lacks any audience appeal. Even die-hard Western fans found themselves checking their watches. It's heavy on angst, light on entertainment. What makes it truly painful is the unrelenting bleakness without payoff. We watch nearly 2 hours of Hackman's character being cruel and abusive to Ullmann, with minimal character development or redemption arc. The film was heavily cut by Warner Brothers after poor preview screenings, which only made the narrative more disjointed. Troell, coming off his acclaimed Swedish epics, The Emigrants and The New Land, seemed completely lost working within the Hollywood system. The beautiful Big Sur locations are wasted on a story that feels more like a depressing domestic drama than a Western. Turner Classic Movies noted it was heavy on realism but lacking in audience appeal, a polite way of saying it's a crushing bore. Even Reddit users who generally defend overlooked Westerns call this one clunky and a little boring, with the uncomfortable wife abuse storyline handled without the nuance it desperately needed. 12. A Gunfight, 1971. Johnny Cash and Kirk Douglas star in this existential Western that asks, what if two legendary gunfighters sold tickets to their own duel? Sounds intriguing, right? Unfortunately, the execution is as lifeless as the corpses these characters leave behind. The film crawls toward its inevitable conclusion with all the excitement of watching tumbleweeds. Cash, despite being a music legend, proves why he wasn't a leading man. And even Douglas can't inject life into this philosophically pretentious script. Critics found it slow and uneventful, which is basically a death sentence for a Western. The premise, two aging gunslingers agreeing to a public duel to provide for their families, could have been powerful in the right hands. Instead, we get endless scenes of the two men brooding, talking about mortality, and doing absolutely nothing. The philosophical musings feel forced and undergraduate level, lacking any genuine insight into violence or masculinity. Cash's stiff, monotone delivery might work in his music, but on screen he's wooden and unconvincing. The film's biggest sin is being boring. At 89 minutes, it feels twice as long. The climactic gunfight, when it finally arrives, is anticlimactic and unsatisfying. Director Lamont Johnson seemed more interested in making a pretentious art film than an engaging Western. Even the novelty of seeing Cash and Douglas together can't save this snooze fest from being a complete misfire. 11. The Hunting Party, 1971. Oliver Reed, Gene Hackman, and Candice Bergen in a Western. What could go wrong? Apparently, everything. This British-made Western features excessive violence without purpose, a muddled plot, and bizarre tonal shifts that'll give you whiplash. Reed plays a bandit who kidnaps Bergen, while Hackman hunts them with high-powered rifles. It aims for shocking and brutal, but lands on gratuitous and unpleasant. The film was criticized for its sadistic violence and poor direction. Even the beautiful Spanish locations can't save this one from being a tedious, ugly experience. The film's biggest problem is its mean-spirited cruelty masquerading as edginess. Hackman's character uses a high-powered rifle with a telescopic sight to pick off Reed's gang members from a distance, leading to graphic, lingering death scenes that serve no narrative purpose. Bergen's character is caught in an uncomfortable quasi-romance with her captor that feels exploitative and poorly developed. Director Don Medford seems to have no control over tone, lurching from grim brutality to bizarre comedy attempts. The violence feels sadistic rather than impactful. We see people blown apart in graphic detail, but there's no emotional weight to any of it. Critics at the time called it unpleasant and poorly executed, and modern viewers find it even more problematic. It's trying to be a revisionist Western, but just comes across as nasty and unpleasant. Even fans of darker Westerns find this one too ugly and nihilistic to enjoy. Taste, Dirty Little Billy, 1972. Expanded reasoning, 150 words. Director Stan Dragotti seems to have confused realistic with deliberately unpleasant. The entire film is shot in washed-out, muddy browns and grays, with characters perpetually covered in filth. Pollard, best known for his quirky supporting role in Bonnie and Clyde, is miscast as Billy. He lacks any charisma or menace, coming across as merely pathetic. The film follows young Billy's descent into petty crime and murder, but without any insight into his psychology or motivation. It's just depressing scene after depressing scene of a loser wallowing in muck. The pacing is glacial, with long stretches of nothing happening. While some critics praised its demythologizing approach, audiences stayed away in droves. It's the kind of revisionist Western that gives revisionist Westerns a bad name, stripping away the myth, but offering nothing compelling in its place. Watching it feels like being trapped in a muddy Kansas town with no way out. The film mistakes ugliness for authenticity and boredom for artistic integrity, resulting in a joyless slog that respects neither its subject nor its audience. Factor 9. The Train Robbers, 1973. Expanded reasoning. At 92 minutes, The Train Robbers somehow feels endless. Wayne plays a gunfighter hired by a widow, Anne Margaret, to recover gold stolen by her late husband, accompanied by a band of aging cowboys. The problem? We've seen this exact plot in dozens of better westerns. There's zero chemistry between Wayne and Anne Margaret. The supporting characters are cardboard cutouts, and the action sequences are staged without any energy or excitement. Director Burt Kennedy, who'd made better westerns in the 60s, seems to be phoning it in. The twist ending is telegraphed from a mile away and lands with a thud. Wayne himself looks tired and disengaged. He was 65 during filming, and it shows. The dialogue is bland, the cinematography is flat, and the whole thing feels like a lazy cash grab made to capitalize on Wayne's name. Even the film's own publicity acknowledged it was just another John Wayne Western without trying to be anything more. It's not offensively bad, just terminally mediocre and instantly forgettable. The kind of movie that plays on afternoon TV and puts you to sleep before the second commercial break. Buddy 8. Molly and Lawless John, 1972. This low-budget oddity tries to be a psychological drama about a sheriff's wife who falls for an outlaw, but it's really just slow, poorly acted, and confusing. Vera Miles stars in what should be a tense cat-and-mouse game, but instead plays like a boring afternoon soap opera. The film can't decide what it wants to be. Romance? Thriller? Character study? It fails at all three. The pacing is glacial. The budget shows in every frame, and the whole thing feels like a TV movie that accidentally made it to theaters. Critics ignored it, and so did audiences. Vera Miles, fresh off her memorable role in Psycho over a decade earlier, deserved better than this confused mess. The premise, a sheriff's wife helping an outlaw escape and possibly falling for him, could have been psychologically complex in the hands of a better director. Instead, we get awkward, stilted dialogue scenes where nothing of consequence happens. Sam Elliott appears in an early role and seems as confused by the script as we are. The film's low budget is evident in every scene: cheap sets, poor lighting, amateurish cinematography. But budget constraints can't excuse the incoherent storytelling and lifeless performances. The romance between Molly and John is never believable or compelling, lacking any real chemistry or motivation. Director Gary Nelson, who'd later helm Freaky Friday, seems completely out of his depth. The film limps to a conclusion that resolves nothing and leaves viewers wondering why they wasted 98 minutes of their life. It's the kind of forgettable dreck that played the bottom half of double features before disappearing forever. Roy 7. Kid Blue, 1973. Dennis Hopper in an offbeat comedy western about a train robber trying to go straight? In theory, this could work. In practice, Kid Blue is a confused, unfunny mess that doesn't know what tone it's aiming for. The film wants to be a quirky, countercultural take on the Western, but ends up being tedious and self-indulgent. Hopper seems lost. The IT comedy doesn't land, and the whole thing feels like a bad acid trip through the Old West. One critic called it an embarrassing misfire, and 40-plus years later, it's still barely watchable. 6. The Great Northfield, Minnesota Raid, 1972. Don't let the interesting true story fool you. This retelling of the James Younger Gang's infamous bank robbery is a chaotic, poorly structured disaster. Robert Duvall and Cliff Robertson try their best, but the script is a jumbled mess that can't sustain narrative momentum. Director Philip Kaufman went for revisionist and gritty, but achieved confusing and dull. The film has interesting moments buried under bad editing and a tone that swings wildly between serious and silly. Critics were divided, but audiences voted with their feet, walking right out of theaters. The film's fatal flaw is its schizophrenic tone and incoherent structure. Kaufman wants to demythologize the James Gang and show them as violent, somewhat pathetic criminals rather than romantic outlaws, a valid approach. But the execution is a mess. Duvall plays Jesse James as a paranoid, twitchy weirdo, while Robertson's Cole Younger is barely characterized at all. The film jumps around in time confusingly, with bizarre comedic interludes that clash jarringly with the violent scenes. One minute we're watching a brutal shootout, the next there's a silly baseball game scene that feels imported from another movie entirely. The infamous Northfield Raid, when it finally happens, is poorly staged and anticlimactic. The editing is choppy, making it hard to follow who's doing what. At 91 minutes it should be punchy and tight, but instead it feels both rushed and sluggish. Some critics praised its revisionist approach, but most found it a confusing, frustrating failure that squandered a fascinating true story. It's a textbook case of good intentions meeting poor execution. Number 5. The Desperadoes, 1969-1970. Expanded reasoning. Director Henry Levin, a veteran of countless B-movies, brings nothing fresh or interesting to this tired material. The plot follows a Texas parson turned outlaw leading a gang of misfits, but it's told with all the energy of a funeral procession. Vince Edwards, hot off TV's Ben Casey, proves that television charisma doesn't always translate to the big screen. He's bland and forgettable. Jack Palance, who could elevate even bad material with sheer presence, looks bored and disconnected, probably counting his paycheck. The action sequences are poorly choreographed and shot, lacking any sense of danger or excitement. The film's biggest sin is being utterly generic. There's not a single original idea or memorable moment in its entire 90-minute runtime. The production design looks cheap, the costumes look like they came from a costume shop, and the whole thing has that flat, rushed quality of a tax write-off. It played the bottom half of drive-in double features and was quickly forgotten, which is exactly what it deserved. Even Western completists struggle to sit through this one. 4. The McMasters, 1970. Expanded reasoning. This film perfectly demonstrates how good intentions don't guarantee good results. Peters plays Benji McMasters, who returns to his former master's ranch after the war, only to face racism and violence. The script wants to make important statements about race relations, but it's so ham-fisted and obvious that it becomes laughable. Characters literally stand around making speeches about racism rather than living as believable people. The violence escalates to ludicrous levels, rape, torture, and massacre, that feels exploitative rather than meaningful. Director Alf Kjellin has no control over tone, resulting in a film that's preachy one moment and grindhouse violent the next. Burl Ives, normally a solid character actor, is embarrassingly bad as the well-meaning rancher. The cinematography is muddy and ugly, the pacing is all wrong, and the whole thing reeks of producers trying to cash in on early 70s racial consciousness while actually having nothing meaningful to say. It's insulting to the serious issues it pretends to address. The film was rightfully forgotten, though it occasionally resurfaces as an example of how not to make a message movie. 3. Macho Callahan, 1970. Expanded reasoning. Director Bernard Kowalski specialized in B-movies and exploitation fare, and it shows in every frame of this nasty little film. Janssen, best known as TV's The Fugitive, tries to bring depth to Callahan, but can't overcome the one-note script. The character has no redeeming qualities whatsoever. He's just an angry, violent sociopath seeking revenge. The problem is, we never care about him or his quest. The violence is graphic and unpleasant without being meaningful. People are shot, stabbed, and beaten, but it generates no emotional response because the film gives us no one to empathize with. Jean Seberg, in one of her final American films, plays a prostitute and looks genuinely miserable, perhaps reflecting her real feelings about being in this trash. The cinematography is harsh and ugly, emphasizing mud, blood, and grime. At 99 minutes, it's an endurance test of relentless negativity. There are no moments of humor, humanity, or hope. Just 99 minutes of watching an unlikable protagonist commit acts of violence. Even revisionist westerns that depict the Old West as brutal and ugly usually have some point to make. Macho Callahan is just wallowing in ugliness for its own sake. For 2, The Spikes Gang, 1974. Expanded reasoning. Richard Fleischer, who directed genuine classics like 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Fantastic Voyage, delivers one of his weakest efforts here. The film suffers from a fatal identity crisis. It starts as an almost wholesome tale of naive farm boys who help a wounded outlaw, then awkwardly shifts into a dark, violent story of their moral corruption. The tonal whiplash is jarring. Ron Howard, TV's golden boy from Happy Days, is miscast and unconvincing as a hardening criminal. Lee Marvin sleepwalks through yet another grizzled outlaw role, looking tired and disengaged. The pacing is glacial, with long stretches where nothing meaningful happens. When the violence finally comes, it feels arbitrary and unearned because we haven't been given enough character development to care. The climax is brutally depressing but unearned. The film hasn't done the work to make us invested in these characters' fates. At 96 minutes, it somehow feels both too long and underdeveloped. It's the kind of mediocre, forgettable Western that cluttered theaters in the mid-70s as the genre gasped its last breaths. Nobody hates it passionately, but nobody remembers it fondly either. Number 1. Paint Your Wagon, 1969. While technically released in late '69, Paint Your Wagon dominated worst Western discussions throughout the early 70s, and it deserves the top spot on this list. This bloated, 3-hour musical Western stars Lee Marvin and Clint Eastwood as gold prospectors who share a wife, played by Gene Seberg. Yes, you read that right. What makes it so bad? Where do we start? Marvin and Eastwood couldn't sing, yet they're in a musical. The plot is nonsensical. The pacing is glacial. The $20 million budget, massive for 1969, is wasted on a boring story about a mining camp. Eastwood later said it was one of the worst experiences of his career. The film did respectably at the box office initially, but has been critically savaged ever since. Roger Ebert called it unbearably corny, and modern audiences find it nearly unwatchable despite its A-list cast. Even die-hard fans of Eastwood skip this one. It's not the worst movie ever made, but it might be the most disappointing waste of talent and money from the entire decade of Western filmmaking. And there you have it, folks. 15 Westerns from the 1970s that proved even the most talented actors and biggest budgets can't save a bad script, poor direction, or misguided vision. The 70s was actually a fascinating era for Westerns. The genre was evolving, trying to be more realistic, more psychological, more experimental. Sometimes that worked, giving us classics like The Wild Bunch and Little Big Man, but sometimes, as we've seen today, those experiments went terribly, terribly wrong. What's interesting is that many of these films had potential. They had talented casts, experienced directors, and decent budgets. But somewhere between concept and execution, things fell apart. Bad scripts, studio interference, miscasting, tonal confusion, all contributed to these cinematic disasters. Here's the thing, though. Bad movies serve a purpose. They remind us how hard it is to make a good film. They make us appreciate the classics even more. And honestly, some of these are fun to watch because they're so bad. There's entertainment value in cinematic failure. So here's my question for you. Have you seen any of these films? Do you think I was too harsh on any of them? Or did I miss an even worse 70s Western that deserves to be on this list? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into cinematic disasters, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and check out our other worst of lists. We've covered horror, sci-fi, and action, with plenty more genres coming. Remember, life's too short for bad movies, unless you're watching them ironically with friends. In that case, saddle up and enjoy the train wreck. Until next time, this has been your channel name. Keep watching, keep discussing, and remember, even the worst Westerns teach us something about filmmaking. Ride off into the sunset, folks. Just maybe avoid these 15 films along the way.